Okay, so it's 2 o'clock now and we are about to begin. Thank you to everyone for joining us today for the webinar called Enhance Your Leadership Skills with Major Matina Jewell. I'm Chris Demopoulos, Marketing Manager at Safetrac, and Safetrac is Australia's best compliance training program, voted 10 years in a row by the LearnX Foundation. Now, before we get into today's webinar, just a few housekeeping rules. You'll see on your screen there's a Q&A tool and a chat function, and we encourage you to use these throughout the session to engage with our panelists. My colleague Katie will be capturing these comments and questions as we go, and at the end, should we have some time, we'll ask our panelists these questions. If we do run out of time, don't worry, we'll capture all of these down and we'll try to get back to you over email. Now, over to your panelists. Today, we're fortunate to have with us Deborah Coram, a lawyer by profession, formerly with Minter Ellison, and now CEO and part owner of Safetrac, where she has been our fearless leader since 2011. Deb has more than 15 years experience in the legal technology service and software industry, and that includes senior positions here in Australia, the US and the UK. We are also very fortunate to have Matina Jewell join us today. Within her 15-year military career, Matina was appointed Officer in Command at just 23 years of age and was the first woman in Australian Army to complete the Navy Ship Divers course and became the only Australian to receive 2 Republic of Lebanon War medals. Matina's here today to share her insights on leadership and resilience from some of the toughest environments on earth. So thank you, Matina, for being able to be here and share those with us today. Now, before I hand over to you, Deb, I'm going to play a quick intro video for those who aren't familiar with Matina. Oops. Sorry, technical difficulties.
So I went to the Middle East as a peacekeeper, first to Syria and then Lebanon. But I didn't think that on this peacekeeping operation it would be far more dangerous than anything I'd experienced in my 15-year career.
3 times hits on Sierra Papa 6.
12th of July on Patrol Base Kiam. We've had a call to go back to the patrol base as there's artillery fire, small arms firing around Patrol Base Kin. Another aerial bomb dropped by an Israeli jet. This one's hit Sierra Papa 3. Large plumes coming off. Thankfully none of us are injured. There was a bit of shrapnel, and the blast from the rocket hitting the position actually came over the platform here where I'm standing now. Been getting the order to start moving into Tia. The highest ranking officer, I assume, commanded the convoy and was also responsible for navigation. Yeah, we're waiting to roll out these gates, buddy. And we're heading to Tia as fast as we possibly can, so fingers crossed we make it.
16 artillery rounds have landed.
A direct hit from an Israeli bomb obliterated the clearly marked UN Hilltop Observer Post at Khayyam.
Deb, sorry, you're on mute still.
I was saying that's pretty frightening footage to watch. And I put myself in your situation, and you're there as a peacekeeper, and you land yourself in a situation which is really warfare when you thought you were there on a peacekeeping mission. I noticed during the footage you say that you were the highest ranking officer there, and therefore assumed the leadership position in the situation you found yourself. Even though you were not expected to be in the situation you found yourself to be in. How, in that position, when you're fostered into this sudden leadership position, do you deal with the trauma and the surrounds of what's thrown at you, and how do you lead your group when you no doubt yourself are suffering trauma and shock from the situation?
Yeah, and it's a great question, Deb, and a really good way, I guess, to start our session today. In that, that environment in the Lebanon War, as you say, I was an unarmed peacekeeper, a military peacekeeper with UN. This was a mission that had military personnel from over 23 different nations contributing to that particular mission. And, this was my 5th overseas deployment, but this one was where I was representing Australia with the UN. So I was the only Australian, also the only woman in my team patrol regions, both in Syria and Lebanon. And I'd been there for 13 months on this mission when suddenly, the war unfolds and, breaks out. As we said, from a split second, we went from monitoring a peace agreement to suddenly being under threat and under attack ourselves. And needing to report the violations of the peace agreements between these countries that were now at war. But, I guess it's that, taking those lessons from that sudden leadership, sudden, rapidly changing, evolving situation that I faced in my military career, not only in the Lebanon War, but through different missions, and taking those principles and learnings, back to business. And I guess your question around how do you cope with that sudden change of an environment, I guess we've all had that experience in COVID now with business, that suddenly how we operated has changed. We have to need to adapt very quickly, and we need to continue adapting for as long as we need to as this situation continues to unfold, and we don't have control over how long that's going to be. And I guess for me as an Australian Army officer, one of the things I was very thankful for was the actual training that we receive in the Australian Defence Force, particularly in leadership positions. And we see that, leaders across the entire organisation, I think it's a very big difference from military to the corporate and to business world, is that I see leaders at every single level of the business being needed to be a successful, functioning, effective and agile business. So we'll train our leaders. The first layer of leadership in the Army, we say corporals run the Army rather than generals, because they're our first level of leadership. They're there on that operational front line, and we need to empower them in a way where they can be decisive and make decisions as things unfold around them, because often on the battlefield, we don't have time to be able to go back through the layers of command for someone to be able to take action.
So how much sort of training and skills do you have at a more junior level that prepares you for leadership in a more senior level? As you say, in a corporate sense, often our junior staff are not trained in leadership. It's not until we're placed into a position where we're promoted or we're going to be promoted that we train our staff in leadership skills. So that seems to me a really big contrast.
Yeah, it is. I think, in the military, so for my, talking from my own experience, I went through ADFA, the Australian Defence Force Academy, where I did my 3 years of university studies as well as my military leadership training, and then spent an entire year, 12 months training at Duntroon, the Royal Military College of Duntroon, where you do straight Army leadership training. So it's a 4-year training in terms of leadership to then graduate from Duntroon as a young lieutenant. I was 21 years of age. And go out in your first command posting where you then have the soldier stream. So you have then people in your team, your sergeants, your warrant officers. I had brilliant senior soldiers in my team when I first graduated. I was very fortunate for that knowledge that I had around me. But these guys had been in the Army longer than I'd been alive. And I was, the leader of that team. And I think it taught me a lot about inclusive leadership. And I think there's a bit of a misnomer that, in military, that we have this very structured hierarchy, but we have these situations where we want to include that knowledge, and we certainly want to make sure we bring all that experience that we have around us from our soldiers, and they're leaders in their own right in those specific skill sets, and bring that to the fore as you're making decisions as the overall commander of those situations. So it's a dedicated leadership training, which I think is often different to many businesses that I've experienced since being out of the military.
And what do you think are the critical parts of that leadership training being able to be utilised in that environment? You mentioned inclusivity. I imagine trust is a big part of that as well, in that I guess at any point in time in your situation, a senior officer could be taken out. So the expectation, I guess, is at some stage any one particular person could be asked to step up and needs to have the skill set to do so, and for other people to trust in that person. So there's a real process there that I think is very different from a corporate situation where we're expecting our leader to continue to be there all the time, not expect somebody else that could just step into their position tomorrow. So how do you build those trust and inclusivity, communication, that sort of thing? How do you go about that?
Yeah, exactly. Great question. I think, and trust is something that we need to earn, rather than simply wear, in my case, in a rank on my shoulder, my appointment title, but, transferring that to business of, a position holder, rather than just simply wearing the position and demanding trust. We need as leaders to actually build and earn that trust. And it's a two-way street where, it goes up and down that hierarchy of an organization. That trust needs to be earned in both directions. But particularly for me, when I'm in situations where I literally am making decisions that are going to impact on people's lives on the battlefield, I think trust is something you should have to earn. And I think as a woman in a male-dominated environment, that was something I had to do every single posting, probably more so than my male counterparts. And I actually, during my career, I found that quite frustrating as a woman. Each time I posted, and the military, we'd normally post every 2 to 3 years to a different location. So you'd have a big turnover of your team, as you're saying, the leader is moving on. So it was a usual thing. We got used to having a rotation of command. But I knew that I had to earn that trust and respect of my team as quick as I possibly could. And that was by proving myself capable, efficient in the job that I was sent to do. And that would change from job to job. Some jobs were more physically demanding. So as a Navy diver, I had to have the physical skills to be able to carry out the job that I was in. There was other jobs, was a UN peacekeeper, where it was more about my diplomacy, my language skills, being able to speak Arabic, which literally saved my life during the war and the soldiers that I was commanding. So those skills will change and evolve as you move through your career. But I think it's really important that we, as leaders, learn that we need to earn that trust and respect from our people as quick as we possibly can. Because once we got that trust, then we were able to adapt our leadership style as appropriate as situations unfold. So although I mentioned, Deb, that my preferred style is to be an inclusive leader, there was times where I had to change into more of authoritative leadership style on the battlefield where that was appropriate. As bombs were incoming, as rounds cracking over our heads, it wasn't appropriate to try and, get a group huddle, ask the team what they thought we should do right then and there. It required me to be quite decisive, authoritative, to give orders and know that my soldiers would carry out those instructions without questions because of the time factor. So once we've got that trust, we can then evolve the way that we lead as the situation unfolds around us. And that then becomes, I think, most environments now need adaptive leadership skills and leadership style so that you can transition quickly and bring your team with you on that journey, only if you've built that trust and rapport first.
Yeah, some really interesting points you bring there, and very salient given the year that we've all just had. One of my staff this morning reminded me that today is a year from the day that we all started working from home in our business. And that was a fairly authoritative decision on my behalf at the time to say, I don't care what's going on with this virus. I want you guys to be safe and I want you working at home, and that's what we're going to do. Yeah. And yet after we were working from home, it then had to become one based on communication about how are you going? What do you need? How are we going to do this? And figuring it out and working together. And that sort of became more communication and more collaboration. So utilizing those skills is, has been, very important, and being able to transfer from one type of leadership skill to another. has been critical.
And I would say too, I'd add into that too, Deb, that I think communication is one of those skills that's needed to build trust as well. So when you're trying to connect with people, to build that trust and rapport and that relationship with your team, particularly in times of crisis and where things are evolving, people have got that anxiety, uncertainty, that change period. It's through communication as a leader that will alleviate a lot of that anxiety for your team and bring them on the journey wherever you need to get to. So, I think communication really is one of those linchpin skills as a leader, and one of the modules that we cover in this online program, because I think it's so vital and so poignant right now as we're all adapting to the COVID environment. A lot of hybrid things are happening right now. And the only way you can keep your business driving forward is through very clear, concise communication.
Well, I mean, what we're all driving through right now, and again, this is a great synergy for where you come from, is uncertainty. We're all navigating an environment of, we're not really sure what's ahead of us. We really don't know what's around the corner. That's the environment in which is your everyday workplace, I imagine.
Exactly. In fact, the military, we train for uncertainty. I guess, on the battlefield and what we've all experienced in business over the last 12 months, I think, the things that I've been asked as a keynote speaker to come in and talk to various organizations over the last 12 months has been around those two factors of uncertainty and lack of control. And they are two elements that are very present on the battlefield that, when the Mayday call comes over the radio announcing a war, no one tells you, and they can't tell you, is that's going to go for 10 hours, 10 days, 10 weeks, or 10 years. You have to continue operating in that environment as long as it takes, as long as we, can reach a peaceful status in that situation. So it's one of those things we have to train our people to be able to cope with uncertainty and cope when things change and evolve or don't go as planned. The other component is that the lack of control. And I think it's one of the things a lot of us have struggled over the last year of that, we can't control government changes and regulations. We've had to adapt our businesses as a result of those restrictions that have been placed upon the way that we would normally operate. And it's the same on the battlefield. We literally can't control at least 50% of the picture. We can't control the enemy. What we can do though is respond appropriately to the enemy's actions. So it's about keeping awareness of that circle that we don't have control over and focusing all of our energies into the bits that we do have control so that we can respond rapidly and change as required from the elements that come out of that circle of lack of control.
One of the things I guess also strikes me is decision making, in that our decision making in times of uncertainty has to be somewhat rapid, and sometimes those decisions may not be the right decision. And I guess how do you, in your circumstances, go about navigating that?
We spend a lot of time in the military working on our decision making as leaders and making decisions under pressure. So I guess the military, we train all of our exercises. We actually train for these specific topics that we're covering right now today, that uncertainty, the lack of control. We'll train where everything goes wrong. And as a leader, you then have to come up with something, you think outside the box and come up with a solution that no one's even thought was possible, because they call it, the fog of war, the confusion of the battlefield. We need a robust, very agile in thinking leaders who are able to try and just find that one solution that will get the team out the other side and continue surviving. And so we put our people under this extraordinary pressure to try and simulate that battlefield condition as close as we possibly can. So decision-making is one of those critical elements that I think as leaders, and I'll talk about, in the module on decision-making, about my experience of commanding a convoy through that Lebanon War. You saw some of the footage at the start there that Chris played for us. That, I had 2 armoured personnel carriers. I had 16 Indian and Ghanaian infantry soldiers under my command. What should have taken 2 hours for me to get that convoy through to headquarters actually took over 2 days, with heavy fire from both sides of that war, which from the Israeli Defence Force and the Hezbollah operating in southern Lebanon. And so, that 2-day transit, I faced a lot of leadership challenges, and probably the biggest challenge I faced was being able to keep momentum in my decision-making capacity, keep making those decisions to stay alive. And I often talk about that momentum, that the worst thing I could have done, I was in a situation where I knew that Israeli fighter jets were coming in to bomb in the vicinity of our region. The road that I was on was one of the roads that was going to be targeted during that airstrike. You know, it was turning out to be a bit of a tough day in the office for me at that point in time, that knowing we're on this road, we're in danger, and I was having to make decisions and going through that decision risk responsibility process that I shared during that module. I'll talk about, you know, the worst thing I could have done at that moment when I had those 16 lives in my hands was to make or to become immobilized by fear and not be able to make any decision. So often in these times of crisis, so long as we can keep making decisions, even if we make the wrong decision or the situation changes, we can just simply make another decision and get back on track far quicker than if we become immobilized by fear, unable to make a decision, and we become quite stagnant. It then takes a lot more courage to make that first step forward and start making decisions again. So often in the military, we'll just keep making decisions, and we put our people under pressure. I remember outfield having, you know, the training team, you know, yelling at me, saying, make a decision, troop commander, make a decision now, and sort of putting that pressure of, you know, where your brain's got to come through those processes of analyzing the situations, the options you have at hand, working through all of your actions on, and having to make a decision very quickly under huge, immense pressure. So that when you get to the battlefield, it's not the first time you've encountered that level of extreme pressure when you're making a life and death decision.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I don't think corporations do enough of that role play. And I think, you know, the sudden leadership that's often foisted upon people and the decision making they all of a sudden have to be making is something that we can do a better job of training people in. And we're seeing increasingly in the media, leaders being in the media for the wrong reasons, for not leading well, for us not having good decision making structures and processes in place, and then the ramifications of that are landing on corporations and people in the media for all the wrong reasons. So we're starting to see a really strong link between good leadership and good culture and good compliance. So this is sort of why we're tying all this together. We think these are all really intricately linked. Look, I think sudden leadership's a really interesting thing, and I'm wondering, Chris, we've created a poll on sudden leadership that we can ask our audience.
Absolutely. Let's launch that poll. It's here we go. We'll throw it out there. Thinking of a time where you were suddenly thrown into a leadership role or a situation where you needed to show leadership among your peers. How did you feel going into this situation? So it'd be good to get our audience engaged in this and see how they felt.
And why you poll that, Chris? I'm really interested to how Matina responds to this. So Matina, having come from her situation with all of the training and preparation she'd had, how would you respond to that question, Matina?
Look, I think feeling in those situations, I don't think that nerves is a bad thing, is probably my answer, that you're going to feel nervous, particularly when in those situations where leadership isn't part of our daily roles and responsibilities, where it hasn't been explicitly put in our job description. To ask someone then to step up and lead, it takes a huge amount of courage for them to kind of put themselves out there into that leadership position and to act and take control of a situation. And so nerves are going to be a natural response in that human response to that situation. And I guess, you know, I share a story of probably the biggest sudden leadership situation I was thrown into in my career, where I was in the Solomon Islands on my second mission in Solomons. And I was involved in capturing one of the warlords of the Malayan Eagle Force, Jimmy Rasta. So he headed up the Malayan Eagle Force. And we're finding just the cultural situation on the ground there, that our male soldiers that were out and patrolling these regions, trying to locate Rasta and his men, weren't able to get any information or intelligence from the women of these communities, because the Solomons is a matriarchal society. So it was suddenly decided to pull me out of headquarters at Honiara, put me on a chopper, throw me out to a very remote island and embed me into a Papua New Guinean infantry platoon. So these are men that I've never met with before, never trained with, and suddenly on operations, and we're literally hacking our way through the jungle out to these remote communities to talk with those communities to see if we can find any information about Jimmy Rasta and the Malayan Eagles. And I was finding in that situation, even though I was not the appointed commander, I was simply a liaison officer, I was being thrown into these scenarios where the Papua New Guinean soldiers were wanting me to make decisions for them, even though I kept reiterating that I wasn't, the authorized commander. And we then had this situation where we bumped into Jimmy Rasta and 4 of his militiamen at a markets. And so we're involved in this situation where Rasta had asked one of the Papua New Guinean soldiers, who is your leader? And the soldiers pointed to me. And so I've suddenly become face to face with a warlord. And I'm still trying to say, I'm actually not the appointed leader, but I was happy to jump in and control this very absurd situation. We're then involved in sort of the arrest of Rasta and his men. And you'll get to hear about that story in the first module in the Sudden Leadership. So I won't tell you any more about that. I don't want to spoil it.
It sounds like an excellent lesson in diversity amongst the forces too, Matina.
There's a whole lot of things that can flow out of that one situation.
Yeah.
But, you know, I was just suddenly thrown into this scenario where I had to step up and lead and take control of a situation. And I know from that experience myself that, and that happened a lot of the time throughout my career over 15 years, where, as you'd sort of mentioned right at the start, Deb, where I had a boss who fell ill, had to leave the environment and never returned. So I was suddenly promoted twice in 2 weeks, from lieutenant to captain, then acting major, and ended up having to command then for the next 2 years and cover both of those jobs for the next 2 years. And we deployed on 3 back-to-back missions in that time. So there's lots of those situations for military people where we are expected to be able to step up, lead, take control of situations, but I know it takes enormous courage when you haven't been appointed the leader. So I think in people in business, I think over the last 12 months in particular, a lot of our roles and our responsibilities have grown, have sort of changed a bit with the COVID situation. We're now asking people to step up and lead. And this sudden leadership is a sort of a theme and a topic that I'm encountering with all sorts of organizations across industries is something that they're struggling with.
Chris, how did our poll go?
Yeah, so it was quite interesting. Half of our audience, I'll share the results here, half of our audience basically felt nervous in that situation where they were just thrust into sudden leadership. So, Maddie, I think you mentioned that the military does a great job of training you to be thrust into that sort of area of leadership, because you just don't know when that time's going to come.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, you're seeing the second most popular response there is that they're good and that, I'm ready for this. And that's great. So, for me, even though I had all that training and I had led at different levels, suddenly though being asked to do much higher than what you were currently operating at, that certainly made me feel a bit nervous, even though I had that skills and knowledge and experience. And it's about kind of backing yourself in those moments and just doing the best job you possibly can, given the situation.
Yeah, just interesting results, and good to see the majority of people are sitting between I'm a bit nervous, but I'm okay to do this. I think the thing is we can never be too prepared, right? We can always be preparing for that next step that we're going to take in our leadership.
Yeah, I think exactly, Deb. And it's about still having that flexibility and adaptability to evolve depending on what's thrown at you in those environments.
I have to say, during the last year where our staff have all worked from home, I think myself and probably every other business owner, business manager has been so enormously pleasantly surprised at how much each of our staff has stepped up and the responsibility and trust, I guess, that we've put in them, but in turn that they have shown us in return. And I think the working from home, has required us to be better at delegating. We're not, one of the things that I miss is that my ear is not in every room in the business, whereas I've always been accused of eavesdropping on people's conversations. I can't do that anymore. So knowing what's going on and ensuring that things are being done and there's systems and processes for delegation, and that people are aware of what they need to do and how they can achieve them. So clear, KPIs, clear requirements for people's roles. How, in terms of that actual delegation is one of the things that I've found that we've needed to work on as a team, so to better manage expectations and to better manage the results. I think that's one of the topics, Matina, that you definitely feel is very, very important in this leadership role.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a whole module dedicated to empowering delegation. So we just want to delegate, we actually want to power people through the process of delegating. And I guess for me as a leader myself, if I think about the skills that I really struggled with in leadership, probably the biggest one was delegation. I found that very hard. And I guess, you know, I was 23, I was doing that job where I was doing 2 jobs at the time. I'd just been promoted twice in 2 weeks. And the role that I was doing, I was sort of on a Navy ship as an amphibious warfare commander and in command of the ship's army department. So that role required at times offloading up to 1,000 army soldiers off multiple Navy ships simultaneously. I would have 6 helicopters and 10 watercraft at my disposal to run those operations. And at times when we were working with special forces, we had to do those operations at night without lights and without radios to communicate. And so I was kind of thrown in the deep end in terms of learning how to delegate effectively, because simply I couldn't do all of that on my own. I couldn't move 1,000 people with all that equipment without really empowering a team to carry out all of those functions in order for us to be successful. So I found that delegating was something I found very difficult, but it became easier if I could communicate and I knew my team. So I think in order to delegate, you need those 2 other factors that go kind of hand in hand together. And even through my military training, I was always told to delegate, but never kind of given a really clear understanding of how to delegate more effectively. So I've created a framework that I share in that module on how to delegate, and I call it the Arks of Fire, 5 Ds of delegating. I'm kind of a simple person. If it's not simple, I'll never remember it. So there's just 5 Ds that you got to remember. And I use this not only from the military, but I use it now in my business myself. And so it's getting really clear of what we want your people to do. So setting that clear objective, clear picture of what success looks like. Then identifying what we don't want them to do. So that kind of those boundaries, the Arks of Fire. So we don't want them to go outside of those in order on their way to achieve the objective. Then deploying all the appropriate assets, the resources and the support so that they can actually achieve the outcome you want. 4 deadlines, actually making sure you've got those key deadlines in place for them to complete the key milestones and keep the task on time. And then 5 is debriefs. And I guess this is the big one. I guess when I've worked with organizations with this framework, usually there is one of those steps that people are missing if they're finding their delegation isn't as effective and achieving the outcomes they want. Probably the most common one is debriefs. And I think this is a big difference between military and business that I've experienced, is that the speed and the frequency that the military that we do debriefs. So we'll debrief after every single patrol because there's no point waiting till the end of the war to share the knowledge that you found on each patrol. So it's the frequency that we debrief, and then it's the length, I guess, that we share that knowledge. So we share it not only up the chain of command in our own organisation, but often when we're working with coalition forces on operations, we want to make sure that every one of our allies is given that access to that information as well, because it might be very critical battlefield intelligence. So that information goes up the chain of command and then as wide as possible. So in a business setting, it's kind of like if you've got silos of happening within your business, trying to get people out of those silos and sharing the knowledge broadly across the entire business. And so that's a quick 5 steps that I've found that, the feedback I've had from all sorts of people across industries in business have found this framework, simple but really effective in terms of when they're about to delegate, just do those 5-point checks, make sure that's happened, and then it's, the delegation seems to increase and improve dramatically.
Yeah, it's certainly a really useful framework, Matina. I think a lot of people, it's assumed that people delegate is just give someone a task to do. But to actually put some structure around how to do that is an extremely useful thing to do, especially in this day. I think when we are working in a remote environment, I think these 5 points that you emphasize are incredibly important to doing it well. Yeah.
And as you say, Deb, but now we're often a lot of people working in these remote areas. If we can delegate a little bit more effectively, we're going to have that high, productivity that we're all aiming for, even though we're sort of isolated in our work environments.
Yeah. So, Maddie, one of the other things that's fascinated me about you and your story and the items that you had to teach us from your experience is communication. I think we've got another video, Chris, that we wanted to take at this point. Is that right?
That's correct, Deb. Yeah, I'll pop that one on. 1 second.
If I can kind of just introduce it while you're doing that, Chris,
please
just
do.
saying the way that the course is sort of structured is that there's 6 modules on different topics, and when you start each of the modules, thanks Chris, you brought up. So the first one is sudden leadership, and my motto is lead even when it's not your job. Then you'll go into delegation and the Arks of Fire, the 5 Ds of getting more done, 5 Ds of delegation. Communication, where I'll share one of the military planning tools that we use. Connection, knowing your team. Decision making, where we're talking about decisions, risks and responsibility and the link between those. And then dutiful leadership. So I talk in that about adaptive leadership styles and the honor and privilege of being a leader. Now, each one of the modules starts with a video of me sharing my experience, and often they're kind of extreme environments on the battlefield of that particular topic of learning before you go into the workbook and get to practice those tools and techniques yourself. You get to use the frameworks. There's a whole lot of activities. Each one of those modules has a whole workbook that sits off so that you can actually embed that knowledge and learning into your own workplace and your own life. But yeah, Chris, if you want to give you a little bit of a taste of what those videos are like, so you've got an understanding of each of them.
Here we go.
Welcome back to the Leadership in Action program. Last time we talked about the power of delegation to empower our people. But delegation is not enough. We also need to communicate effectively. In fact, they go hand in hand. So in this section, I'm going to share the tips and tools that I use for improving communication up and down both my team and line management. After all, effective communication is one of the most important skills leaders can have. From my experience, having been thrown in to serve as one of 4 heads of department on board HMAS Canimbla, which was then Australia's largest warship, I found that delegation, communication, and knowing your people were all key to my success.
So I guess that's a good taste of the program that we have there. Thanks, Maddie, and thanks, Deb, for that. We're sort of coming towards the end of our time. There's 7 odd minutes left, and we've got quite a number of people with their questions coming through. So I might give Katie an opportunity to throw some of those questions out to our panelists. And again, guys, there are quite a number of questions that have come through. We will try and answer as many as we can, but I'd say that a large number of them we'll respond to on email as well. So Katie, over to you.
Thanks, Chris, and thank you, Matina and Deborah. I think that was really fantastic. And as Chris said, we actually did get a lot of questions, so just keep that in mind. I'd love to get through them because they were really fantastic as well. The first one that I'm going to ask, someone has asked, as you've described, leadership style has to be agile in different situations. With this in mind, how did you deal with the mental health of your team while still taking a leadership role with war zone and situations unimaginable to the most of us?
Yeah, that's a great question, Katie. Look, I think as a leader, it's, again, part of that connection with your team, knowing your team, knowing your people, their strengths, their weaknesses, and also knowing how they normally operate, and therefore keeping an eye on them in terms of their mental health, particularly when you're in those very prolonged periods of pressure and high stress situations and environments. So it's also important as a leader to keep a check on yourself as well in those environments and have check-ins from your team as well. So, there's lots of different things. I think black humor, excuse me, is one of those things that comes out in high pressure situations where it is important to have the comedians and empower the comedians in your team to help have that release in those, high pressure situations, so that you can kind of cut through the tension. Because, for most of us, when you're in that long periods of day after day of, you know, life-threatening situation, it will take a toll on you. So you need to find ways that you can have respite, have a break. We try and get our teams to rotate and rest when they can. And we also talk about being combat ready. There's no point having all your gear on ready to fight the enemy if that's the combat stance that you don't need as appropriate at the time. So you want to let people rest. You know, we talk about with all that gear, if you don't need to be standing, sit down. If you don't need to be sitting down, lie down. So basically making sure people are ready at that state and recharging, keeping, you know, an eye on each other, keeping fit and well and healthy, doing all of those natural things of eating well, sleeping well, trying to do all those things to keeping fighting fit as possible in those environments. But, you know, I think sometimes for me as a leader, it was actually a benefit of having a team to be responsible for, because my biggest fear as a leader was not being injured or killed myself, but if I'd made a decision that would result in the injury or death of one of my soldiers. So in many ways, I wasn't so focused on myself, and I saw that as a benefit as being a leader, that I was able to kind of push my own fear of my safety aside because I was so focused on everybody else and keeping us all alive.
Fantastic, thank you. I guess that kind of ties into the next question, and I think these questions are really relevant given what Australia or the rest of the world has gone through with COVID. But Bruce asks, emergency management leadership has to be dynamic as circumstances change. So how do you prepare to and remain calm when circumstances change often?
Yeah, great question, Bruce. I think for me, and it's something I didn't learn in my military career, but it's something I do naturally. And it's only since working with one of the world leading neuroscientists, I've really understood the importance of breath. And I know that probably sounds like a really low tech, maybe an obvious response, but when we're in these crisis situations, it is really important, particularly as leaders, that we take that split second to actually take a deep breath in. Because once we breathe, we're oxygenating the prefrontal cortex of our brain, which is where we want to be making our decisions from. If we hold our breath in those moments, we go into a fight or flight response. And that's where we're not going to make the best decisions. So one of the things that, you know, I've only recently learned that I do naturally is that I continue breathing through crisis situations, and that helps being able to remain in an oxygenated brain state of where you can make good decisions. And I think a second component of that, Bruce, particularly for the emergency management, emergency services people, is similar to, as you're saying, on the battlefield for military commanders, is I needed to remove the emotional connection of what was happening for me so that I could remain in a logical, rational decision-making mindset. I couldn't allow my emotions to get the better of me and then influence my decisions. So in many ways, I had to kind of put the emotions aside so that I could, you know, continue operating and keep making that decision momentum in my decision making and keep the emotions away from it. So I hope that I've answered that in enough detail for you in this short period of time we've got.
It is a short period of time. I don't know how much time we have left, Chris, maybe a couple of minutes. This one should be a pretty simple one, but it's still a good one. Darren asks, how do you actually train people in leadership beyond an academic exercise?
I think it's about taking those leadership theories and skills and actually applying them to the work environment. So I guess that's where the military, you know, are fortunate that we were able to dedicate 4 years of training for our officers to help, and we do so many different exercises and practical application. You know, we don't just sort of sit around an office planning on how we would, you know, work in a war zone. We actually, you know, if you're on ships, if you're in the Navy, you're out at sea and you're actually doing activities and you're practicing those things. If you're in the Air Force, you're in the sky, and if you're on the ground, you're in the Army. You know, you're actually outfield living in tough conditions. They try and, as I said, simulate the battlefield. They'll simulate explosions. They'll simulate the confusion, the noise, and the chaos of a battlefield as you know, as close as we possibly can to the real thing. So that you have that experience of being under that huge pressure. And I think that is kind of the difference between military and business, is that I haven't seen too many businesses that do actually do that practical application rather than just put someone through a course and give them some knowledge. So it's one of the things with this program where we're going to give you some skills, some frameworks, and then you're going to have to do some work. You have to go and actually apply them in your work environment. And obviously, I don't know exactly how every one of you work, but these are the underlying principles across leadership, that I think are applicable regardless of the business, the job title you're in, and the roles and responsibilities you have. I think you'll get something out of this and be able to apply it practically in your work environment.
Awesome, thank you. I think we might be a bit out of time now. What do you reckon, Chris?
Can I just get Matina to extrapolate on the point that she was on onto how we're actually doing that on the online courses that Matina's created and that we've created through the Safetrac platform. Matina, the structure of the courses, we've talked about there being 6 courses. They are what we would call a blended learning solution. They're not just an online course. They comprise a blended solution of videos, workbooks, online tutorials, if you like. Matina, can you maybe explain a little bit about how you're getting the concepts from your military experience and placing them across into that corporate environment so that people can benefit from that and start applying those things in their work experience?
Yeah, perfect. Look, it's a platform that's designed to be able to be mobile, to use, as Chris was displaying, mobile phones, laptops, PCs, to be able to action that. It's all online where they can do all of the workbook activities. There's also an option to print out those activities or purchase booklets, as you can see pictured right now. You'll have flashcards with all the key frameworks and tools from each of the modules that are kind of quick reference things. But the main work is in those workbooks now. So there's a lot of my IP, my experiences, and my frameworks that I've developed across both business and military careers, as well as I had a global research team. So bringing the latest research and knowledge from leadership. So it's not just all my experiences, it's what the latest tips and tools and frameworks are as well. So bringing all that together for you to give you something that's very unique. It's no other product on the market that's going to have this type of knowledge and frameworks for you to have a try of, seeing if it improves your own leadership style. And from the companies that have been using this already are saying that it's initially they bought it for their executive team, and then they've realized it's actually something they need across the levels of the entire business. So aspiring leaders, anyone who, pretty much anyone in the business is benefiting from doing this, not just your top leadership echelons.
Thank you, Matina. Well, we're really, really proud to have the collaboration with you and to be launching your courses through the Safetrac platform. If anybody's got any interest, Chris, do you want to speak about the offer that's on in relation to those courses?
Yeah, we've only got a couple of days left, but for everyone that's online that hasn't taken it up, there is a opportunity to jump into the Matina Jewell Leadership in Action course for free at this stage. So one per company, and we're trying to basically give you guys a taste of what this is like before you have to commit to hopefully engaging the rest of your leadership group and other staff members. So this isn't just for your executive teams or your heads of departments. As Maddie said, it's all about trying to educate and train your staff before they get into that leadership role so that they're well prepared to lead the organization in their current role, but also up the chain as well as leading others. So get on board. The registration page when you first clicked into this webinar should have taken you to that landing page. So if you can get onto that one, and I think Katie's just popped it up. So thank you for putting that into the chat. But we have run out of time today. So thank you again to both Matina Jewell and Deborah Coram for taking us through today, giving us a bit of insight, Matina, into your days in the military and how that's relating to the business world. So thank you for that, and thank you everybody for attending.
My pleasure. Thanks for your time, guys.
Thanks very much. Take care. Bye.